Hey guys, when people hear the words medieval brothel, their brain does something funny. It lights a candle. Not a real candle. A perfect one. Clean. Tall. The kind that never drips wax and never smells bad. The room is warm. The walls are stone, but somehow cozy. There is soft laughter. Maybe a lute playing somewhere. Everyone is relaxed. Everyone is choosing to be there. Time feels slow. Gentle. Almost romantic. This picture lives very comfortably in the modern mind. Movies help. Games help. Novels help. Even history books sometimes help, without meaning to. They talk about brothels as colorful places. A little sinful, sure. But lively. Human. Almost charming. And that is where the problem begins. Because medieval life, in general, was not charming. And medieval brothels were not an exception. They were not a break from hardship. They were built from it. Tonight, we are not here to shock you. We are not here to be loud. We are not here to describe things that do not belong in a bedtime story. We are here to do something quieter. We are here to gently remove the candle. And once the candle is gone, the room looks very different. The first thing to understand is why we even want to imagine medieval brothels as pleasant. The answer is simple. Distance. When something is far away in time, the sharp edges soften. Dirt becomes atmosphere. Pain becomes grit. Control becomes structure. We do this with castles too. We imagine feasts, not hunger. Thrones, not cold stone. Knights, not infections. Brothels get the same treatment. They become symbols of freedom in a world we imagine as overly strict. A little pocket of rebellion. A place where rules loosened and people relaxed. But medieval society did not work like that. Nothing loosened. Everything was regulated. Even sin had paperwork. Medieval brothels existed not because society celebrated pleasure, but because authorities feared chaos. They believed that if desire was not contained, it would spill everywhere. Into churches. Into homes. Into streets. So they built walls around it. Rules around it. Doors that could be closed. That is already very different from the fantasy. This was not about enjoyment. It was about control. The modern imagination also loves the idea of choice. We picture people walking in freely, coins in hand, making a decision for fun. But medieval life rarely offered clean choices. Most decisions were about survival, not desire. And survival does not feel romantic. To get into the right mood tonight, imagine a medieval city at night. Not the postcard version. The real one. Streets are narrow. Mud never fully dries. The smell is a mix of smoke, waste, animals, and old water. Light is weak and uneven. Darkness is thick. A brothel does not glow warmly in this setting. It hides. Often, these buildings were pushed to the edges of town. Near rivers. Near walls. Near places where people did not linger unless they had to. The location alone tells you something important. This is not where comfort lives. Now let's talk about indulgence. Another favorite word. Indulgence suggests excess. Softness. Pleasure taken slowly. Time, in medieval brothels, was not slow. Time was counted. Money was counted. Bodies were counted. Everything was measured because nothing was abundant. The fantasy suggests long nights, lingering touches, conversation, warmth. But medieval cities were loud, crowded, and impatient. Clients were tired. Workers were exhausted. Rooms were small. Beds were shared. Privacy was thin. There was no space for lingering. Lingering costs money. Lingering attracts attention. Lingering invites trouble. Even laughter, when it happened, was not the soft kind. It was loud, sharp, and brief. The kind that ends suddenly when someone raises their voice. And yet, the romantic image survives. Part of this comes from contrast. Modern life, for many people, feels overregulated, digital, disconnected. So the past becomes a place where things felt more real. More physical. More human. We imagine medieval brothels as places where people escaped the rules of church and lord and family. Where bodies mattered more than laws. But the truth is almost the opposite. Brothels were some of the most regulated spaces in medieval cities. Prices were set. Clothing was controlled. Hours were enforced. Behavior was monitored. In some cities, even the positions of beds were standardized. That is not rebellion. That is bureaucracy. A slow, tired, deeply uncomfortable bureaucracy. And this brings us to the quiet thesis of tonight's story. The idea that will follow us gently through every chapter. A night in a medieval brothel was not comfort. It was not freedom. It was not pleasure. It was endurance. Endurance for the people who worked there. Endurance for the people who came there. Endurance for the city that tolerated it while pretending not to see it. This does not mean there were no moments of warmth. Humans are humans, in every century. But warmth was accidental, not designed. It appeared briefly, like sunlight through smoke, and disappeared just as fast. Nothing about the system encouraged kindness. Nothing protected vulnerability. Nothing rewarded rest. That matters. Because when we romanticize these places, we accidentally erase the effort it took just to survive one ordinary night. Not a dramatic night. Not a scandal. Just a regular one. A door opens. A coin changes hands. A rule is followed. A rule is broken. Someone looks away. Someone pretends not to hear. That is the rhythm. As we move forward in this video, we will slow down even more. We will look at rooms, rules, people, sounds, and hours. Not to judge them. Not to fix them. Just to see them clearly. Think of this as standing quietly in the corner of history. Not speaking. Not interrupting. Just observing. So for now, let the fantasy fade gently. No harsh light. No sudden shock. Just a calm realization. The medieval brothel was not a candlelit escape from a hard world. It was part of that hard world. And once you see that, the night becomes very different. The city settles. The street grows quieter. The door closes. And the real story can begin. If medieval cities had suggestion boxes, most of them would be full of complaints. Too crowded. Too loud. Too dirty. Too sinful. Not sinful enough. Medieval cities were pressure cookers. People lived close together. Work was hard. Privacy barely existed. Stress had nowhere to go. And when stress builds up, authorities start looking for ways to manage it. Not solve it. Manage it. This is where the idea of the necessary evil quietly walks in. Medieval leaders did not wake up one morning and decide they liked brothels. Many of them openly hated the idea. Religious leaders preached against them. City councils argued about them. Moral panic showed up regularly, like an unpaid bill. But still, brothels stayed. Not because they were good. Because they were useful. In medieval thinking, the world was already broken. Sin existed. Desire existed. Anger existed. The question was not how to erase these things. That felt unrealistic. The question was where to put them. You do not stop a flood by wishing for dry weather. You build channels and hope the water follows them. Brothels were one of those channels. Authorities believed that if sexual desire had a designated place, it would stay there. If young men had an outlet, they would not harass respectable women. If soldiers had a distraction, they would not riot. If workers could spend their energy somewhere controlled, the streets would stay calmer. This logic feels cold today. And it was cold then too. But it felt practical. Medieval cities were not built on ideals. They were built on damage control. So brothels became part of urban planning. Not proudly. Quietly. Like trash pits, slaughterhouses, and execution grounds. Things you need, but do not want to talk about at dinner. This is why brothels were often owned, licensed, or directly supervised by city authorities. Some cities even collected taxes from them. The same hand that punished sin also charged rent for it. If that feels uncomfortable, good. It should. Because at the heart of medieval life sat a very stable contradiction. Publicly, society claimed moral purity. Privately, it relied on controlled immorality to function. Churches preached chastity. City councils funded brothels. Both believed they were protecting order. No one thought this was strange. In fact, many believed this was responsible leadership. To understand this, you have to let go of modern ideas about liberation. Medieval brothels were not seen as places of freedom. They were not progressive. They were not rebellious. They were not about pleasure for pleasure's sake. They were about containment. Think of a medieval city like a tightly tied bundle. Too tight, and it snaps. So leaders loosened one small knot and hoped the rest would hold. Brothels were that knot. They were placed in specific areas. Often outside main streets. Often near rivers. Sometimes even outside city walls. The message was clear: this exists, but it does not belong. You can go there. But do not bring it back with you. This separation mattered deeply. Medieval life depended on visible boundaries. Clean and unclean. Sacred and profane. Inside and outside. Respectable and tolerated. Brothels sat firmly on the tolerated side. And tolerance is not kindness. Tolerance is permission with conditions. Lots of conditions. Authorities believed that by allowing a limited, controlled space for sex work, they were preventing something worse. Rape. Adultery. Social unrest. Violence. The fear of disorder loomed larger than concern for individual suffering. Order always came first. This is where the humor sneaks in, quietly. Medieval leaders honestly believed that strict rules plus officially approved sin would result in harmony. Like a recipe. Add one regulated brothel. Stir occasionally. City remained stable. Reality, of course, was messier. But medieval thinking loved systems. Loved categories. Loved believing that everything had a place. Even desire. Especially desire. What makes this even more complicated is religion. Medieval Christianity did not pretend sex did not exist. It simply treated it as dangerous. Necessary within marriage. Dangerous everywhere else. Brothels fit into this worldview in a strange way. Some religious thinkers argued that they were like sewers. You do not celebrate a sewer. But you are grateful it exists. There is a famous medieval saying, often repeated in different forms: remove brothels, and society will be flooded with worse sins. This idea was taken seriously. So brothels were allowed to exist, but never respected. Workers were tolerated, but never protected. The building could stand, but the people inside remained morally disposable. That contradiction ran deep. Medieval society was obsessed with morality, but not with mercy. It wanted clean appearances, not clean systems. As long as sin stayed in its assigned corner, leaders could sleep at night. And sleep they did. In better beds. Meanwhile, the people inside those necessary places absorbed the consequences. This chapter is not here to argue whether medieval leaders were right or wrong. History rarely gives us that kind of simple verdict. It is here to show you the logic they lived with. They believed chaos was always one step away. Hunger, plague, fire, war. Everything could collapse quickly. So anything that promised stability, even at a moral cost, felt worth it. Brothels were never about happiness. They were about fear. Fear of disorder. Fear of desire. Fear of what happens when people are pushed too hard. And so, medieval cities made a deal with themselves. They would condemn sin in words. They would permit it in practice. They would look away, but keep records. That is the world we are stepping into. Not a world of indulgence, but a world of compromises. Quiet ones. Uncomfortable ones. The kind that do not feel dramatic, but shape lives anyway. As the night continues, we will see how this idea of containment shaped everything. The buildings. The rules. The people. The hours. For now, just remember this. Medieval brothels existed not because society was relaxed about sex. They existed because society was terrified of losing control. And in that fear, a system was built. A system that worked, as long as you were not the one trapped inside it. The city settles again. The logic feels neat on paper. The streets grow quiet. And somewhere, behind a door placed very carefully out of sight, the consequences of necessary evil wait patiently for night to fall. Medieval brothels were not hard to find. But they were never placed where you would want to find them. They did not sit near marketplaces filled with bread and noise. They did not open onto wide streets where sunlight stayed longer. They were not neighbors to churches, guild halls, or respectable homes. Instead, they were pushed. Gently at first. Then firmly. Then permanently. To the edges. Medieval cities were very good at deciding what belonged in the center and what did not. Power lived in the middle. Trade lived close by. Respectability clung to clean streets and open squares. Everything else was moved outward, like clutter you promised to deal with later. Brothels were part of that clutter. Often, they ended up near riverbanks. Sometimes near city walls. Sometimes just outside them. Places where land was cheap, attention was low, and no one complained too loudly. This was not an accident. Water mattered in medieval cities for many reasons. It was useful. It was dangerous. It carried waste away, at least in theory. And it marked boundaries. If something was near the river, it was already halfway outside normal life. Rivers were noisy. They smelled. They flooded. They attracted animals and insects. They were cold in winter and damp all year round. Putting brothels there solved several problems at once. You could wash floors. You could dump waste. You could keep things moving away. And if someone fell in, well, accidents happened. That last part was rarely written down. But everyone understood it. Being near water also meant being near noise. Not polite noise. Not music and conversation. But sloshing, splashing, carts crossing bridges, people shouting to be heard over the current. Sound travels strangely at night near water. It echoes. It blurs. It hides details. That helped. Authorities did not want brothels to disappear. They wanted them to be distant enough to ignore, but close enough to control. Near enough for inspections. Far enough to avoid embarrassment. Riverbanks were perfect. When brothels were placed near city walls, the message was just as clear. You are inside, but barely. You are part of the city, but not really. One step further and you are outside the law entirely. Walls were symbols of safety. Anything pressed against them felt temporary. Replaceable. And sometimes brothels were placed beyond the walls altogether. This is where things grew quieter. And darker. Outside city walls, there were fewer lamps. Fewer patrols. Fewer witnesses. Roads turned to mud faster. Weather felt harsher. Wind had nothing to block it. At night, the darkness there was not poetic. It was thick. The kind that swallows detail. The kind that makes you walk slower, even if you are in a hurry. Imagine approaching one of these places after sunset. The ground is uneven. Mud sticks to your shoes. You can hear water nearby, but you cannot always see it. The smell hits first. Damp wood. Smoke. Human waste that never fully washes away. There is light, but it is weak. A single lantern. A small window. Enough to say, here, but not enough to feel safe. This was not meant to be inviting. And yet, people came. Isolation was part of the design. When a place is isolated, what happens there feels separate from real life. People behave differently. They lower expectations. They accept things they would not accept elsewhere. That worked for the city. It did not work very well for the people inside. Inside these buildings, walls were thin. Floors were damp. Rooms were small. The outside world pressed in constantly. You could hear carts passing. Dogs barking. The river moving, never stopping. That sound became part of the night. A reminder that time was passing, whether you wanted it to or not. Smells never stayed contained. Smoke from cheap candles mixed with bodies, alcohol, and the nearby water. There was no fresh air system. Windows were small and often kept shut for warmth or privacy. Fresh air was a luxury. Mud followed everyone inside. It clung to hems, shoes, and floors. Straw helped, briefly. Then it became part of the problem. Wet straw smells worse than bare stone. Cleaning was constant and never complete. Darkness filled corners easily. Even when lamps were lit, shadows stayed. Faces looked different. Time felt strange. Minutes stretched. Hours blurred. This physical environment shaped everything that happened inside. People were tired faster. Tempers flared quicker. Fear lingered longer. Isolation does that. There is a modern idea that hidden places feel secret and exciting. But medieval hidden places felt abandoned. Like society had placed them there and stepped back. You are allowed to exist. But you are on your own. That was the unspoken rule. And yet, these places were still connected to the city. Supplies came from inside. Money flowed inward. Rules were enforced from the center outward. This made the isolation even sharper. You could hear the city living normally, just far enough away to remind you that you were not part of it. Laughter from a tavern across the water. Church bells in the distance. Morning carts starting before sunrise. Life went on. Here, on the edge, life paused and waited for night. That waiting shaped the mood. Brothels did not buzz all day. They slept during daylight hours. Doors closed. Windows dark. Streets empty. At night, activity returned like a tide. People arrived quietly. Left quickly. No one lingered outside longer than necessary. These were not social spaces. They were transactional spaces. The isolation helped keep it that way. So when we talk about medieval brothels, we should not imagine warm rooms glowing at the heart of the city. We should imagine places pressed against the margins. Built where noise covered voices. Where water carried things away. Where darkness did not ask questions. This was intentional. Cities hid what they needed but did not want to claim. And in doing so, they created places that felt separate from normal life. Places where different rules applied. Places where survival mattered more than comfort. As the night deepens, that isolation will matter more and more. Fewer witnesses. Fewer protections. More silence between sounds. For now, let the image settle. A narrow path. Mud underfoot. Water moving nearby. A door that does not invite, but allows. The city behind you. The edge beneath you. This is where the night begins. Let's step inside. Carefully. Mind your head. That is not a joke. Low ceilings were very real. Medieval brothels were not built to impress. They were built to fit into whatever space the city gave them. Old houses. Converted sheds. Narrow buildings pressed between others like they were embarrassed to be there. Rooms were small. Not cozy small. More like, turn around carefully, small. Ceilings stayed low to keep heat in during winter. That worked. Sort of. It also trapped smoke, smells, and stale air. After a few hours, breathing felt heavy. Like the room itself was tired. Ventilation was poor. Windows were tiny. Sometimes there were none at all. Fresh air was not a design priority. Privacy came second. Control came first. If you imagine large rooms with flowing curtains, let that image gently leave the room now. Most spaces inside a medieval brothel were divided just enough to say they were separate. Thin walls. Curtains. Wooden partitions that did not reach the ceiling. You could hear everything. Voices. Movements. Arguments. Laughter that stopped too suddenly. Privacy, as we understand it today, simply did not exist. You were never fully alone. And you were never fully unseen. This changes how people behave. When walls are thin, tension leaks. When sound carries, embarrassment fades into resignation. You stop expecting comfort. You stop expecting dignity. The building teaches you that. Beds were simple frames, if they had frames at all. Often they were just platforms. Wood was rough. Splinters were a real concern. Straw was laid on top to soften things, but straw breaks down quickly. It shifts. It flattens. It holds moisture. Wet straw smells terrible. It also attracts insects. Changing it often was expensive. So it stayed longer than it should have. People learned to live with it. Or pretend they did. Stone floors made cleaning easier in theory. In practice, stone stays cold. In winter, it pulled heat straight from your body. Even with straw or rugs, the chill crept upward. Feet went numb. Joints ached. In summer, the stone helped a little. But not enough. Heat had nowhere to escape. Bodies, candles, breath, and movement filled the rooms with warmth that stuck. Sweat had no place to go. Air stopped moving. The room felt thick, like walking through warm water. People complain today about bad air conditioning. Medieval brothels would have loved that problem. Walls were damp more often than not. Water from the ground crept upward. Rain soaked through old roofs. Rivers nearby raised humidity. Stone held moisture like a memory. Touching the wall in winter felt like touching ice. In summer, it felt clammy. Always slightly wrong. The building itself was never neutral. It pressed back. Furniture was minimal. A stool. A chest. Maybe a small table. Everything had to be movable. Easy to replace. Easy to clean. Easy to remove if inspectors came. Nothing sentimental stayed long. Light came from candles or oil lamps. They smoked. They flickered. They cast uneven shadows that made rooms look smaller and faces stranger. Wax dripped everywhere. Oil spilled. Fire was always a risk. You did not relax around fire. You watched it. The building creaked constantly. Wood shifted. Floors complained. The sound of someone walking above you carried clearly. The building never let you forget it was full. This mattered at night. At night, every sound feels louder. A cough. A laugh. A door opening. A footstep outside. You could never fully relax, because you were always listening. That constant awareness wears people down. There were no locks on most interior doors. At best, a latch. Sometimes just a curtain. Entry was controlled by rules and timing, not barriers. Again, privacy was not expected. So it was not protected. In winter, cold dominated everything. No central heating. No steady warmth. Fires helped, but only nearby. The rest of the room stayed cold. Breath fogged. Hands stiffened. People slept in layers. Worked in layers. Lived in layers. And still felt cold. In summer, the opposite happened. The building turned into a box that trapped heat and smells. Sweat mixed with smoke. Air stopped moving. Tempers shortened. The building did not care. Season after season, it stayed the same. Unforgiving. Functional. Tired. This physical environment shaped behavior more than rules ever could. When space is tight, patience shrinks. When air is bad, people rush. When comfort is absent, kindness becomes optional. You do not linger in places like this. You endure them. One of the biggest myths about medieval brothels is softness. Soft beds. Soft light. Soft voices. Soft moments. Nothing about the building was soft. Even quiet felt hard. Heavy. Pressed down by low ceilings and damp walls. The structure reminded everyone why they were there and why they should leave as soon as possible. There was no sense of home here. No attempt to make the space welcoming beyond what was necessary to keep it functioning. These buildings were not meant to be lived in comfortably. They were meant to be used. That distinction matters. A home absorbs you. A workplace shapes you. A brothel building did neither gently. It simply existed, holding people briefly before letting them go. When people left, they carried the feeling with them. The smell in their clothes. The stiffness in their joints. The memory of walls too close. That is how architecture works. It leaves marks. So when we imagine medieval brothels, we should imagine buildings that matched their purpose. Not indulgent. Not warm. Not forgiving. Just adequate. Barely. As the night continues in our story, this building will stay the same. It will not change its mood. It will not soften. It will witness everything quietly. It does not judge. It does not protect. It does not care. It only stands. Low ceiling above. Cold stone below. Air that never quite refreshes. This is the space where the night unfolds, and the building, like the city, will still be standing when the night ends. When people talk about medieval brothels, they often talk around the women. They talk about the building, the rules, the city, the sin. The women become background noise, like furniture that moves. So let's bring them back into focus. Slowly. Carefully. Without drama. Most of the women who worked in medieval brothels did not arrive there with a plan. This was not a career path with options and promotions. There were no brochures. No dreams attached. This was the end of a road, not the start of one. Poverty sat at the center of almost every story. Deep, stubborn poverty. The kind that does not leave room for choices. If you had money, you avoided these places. If you had family, you leaned on them. If you had skills, you used them. Many of these women had none of that. Some were widowed. And in medieval life, widowhood could be dangerous. A husband's death did not just bring grief. It could mean losing housing, income, and protection all at once. If there were no children old enough to help, or no relatives willing to take you in, the fall was fast. Others were displaced. War, famine, fire, and disease moved people constantly. Villages emptied. Cities filled. When you arrive in a city with nothing, the city does not welcome you with open arms. It asks what you can offer. For many women, the answer was, not much. Some were abandoned. Promised marriage that never happened. Employers who dismissed them. Families that sent them away because there was one mouth too many to feed. Medieval society liked to talk about order. But it produced a lot of loose ends. Young women were especially vulnerable. Youth mattered. Not in a romantic way. In a practical one. Younger bodies worked longer. Younger faces attracted more attention. And attention meant money. That is not a compliment. It is a calculation. Older women existed too, but they were fewer. Many did not last long enough. Illness, injury, or simple exhaustion ended their time in brothels early. There was no safety net waiting afterward. So youth was not valued. It was consumed. It is important to say this clearly, most women did not choose this life over better options. They chose it because the other options were worse. Begging. Starving. Sleeping outdoors. Being arrested for vagrancy. Compared to that, a bed, even a bad one, could look like stability. That does not make it freedom. It makes it survival math. Once inside the system, leaving was hard. Money earned often went straight to brothel keepers for rent, food, clothing, and fines. Debts grew quietly. A new dress was required. A fee for breaking a rule. A charge for medical care that barely worked. The door was open in theory. In practice, it led nowhere. What makes this even heavier is how invisible these women were. Medieval records mention brothels often. They list rules, taxes, inspections. They complain about noise. They rarely mention names. Women appear as numbers. As problems. As categories. If they got sick, they disappeared from the records. If they aged, they faded. If they died, the city moved on. This invisibility was not accidental. It made the system easier to maintain. You cannot feel responsible for people you do not fully see. And medieval society was very good at not seeing them. Clothing rules helped with that. Many cities forced brothel workers to wear specific colors or markers. This made them visible in one sense, but socially invisible in another. Everyone could identify them. No one had to respect them. You knew who they were. You did not have to know who they were. That distance mattered. It allowed people to use the service while pretending the person did not exist outside that moment. There is a small, bitter humor in how medieval morality worked here. Society insisted on strict rules about female behavior. Purity mattered. Reputation mattered. Obedience mattered. Then, quietly, it created spaces where those same rules were suspended, but only for certain women. Once labeled, they carried that label everywhere. There was no reset. You could not work 1 year and return to respectability the next. The city remembered. People remembered. Even if you left, the mark stayed. That knowledge shaped how women moved through the world. Many stopped imagining futures. They focused on getting through nights. On avoiding illness. On keeping peace with the brothel keeper. On staying useful. Hope is heavy when you cannot carry it. Inside the brothel, relationships between women were complicated. Sometimes there was solidarity. Shared food. Shared warnings. Shared silence. Sometimes there was rivalry. Fewer clients meant less money. Favor from the keeper mattered. Survival pushes people into corners. This was not a sisterhood built for comfort. It was one built for endurance. And yet, these women were still people. They joked. They complained. They laughed when they could. Humor existed, but it was sharp and practical. The kind that helps you breathe for a moment before the next task. If you listen closely to history, you can almost hear it. Dry comments. Eye rolls. Quiet sarcasm about clients who thought they were impressive. Even in hard places, humans find ways to stay human. But society did not reward that humanity. Outside the brothel walls, these women were treated as warnings. As examples of what happens when order fails. Their existence justified control elsewhere. Inside, they were resources. Neither role offered dignity. So when we imagine medieval brothels, we should not imagine women stepping into candlelight with confidence and choice. We should imagine people arriving tired, uncertain, and already worn down by life. People who did not expect fairness. People who learned quickly what the system demanded. People who became invisible by design. This chapter does not end with a lesson or a solution. History rarely gives us those. It ends with a clearer picture. A group of women standing at the edge of society, holding it together in ways no one wanted to admit. The night continues. The building waits. The city sleeps comfortably. And the women prepare, once again, to be seen only when needed, and forgotten just as fast. People often ask a very modern question about medieval brothels. How did women end up there? It sounds simple. Like there is a clear doorway. A moment. A decision. In reality, there was rarely a single step. It was more like a slow slide. One small loss after another. Each one not quite disastrous on its own. Together, they led somewhere very specific. Debt was one of the most common starting points. Medieval life ran on debt. Owing money was normal. Bread bought on credit. Rent delayed. Tools borrowed. Favors counted. Most people lived just close enough to the edge that one bad season tipped them over. For women, that edge was sharper. A sick parent. A failed harvest. A stolen purse. Suddenly there was money owed and no easy way to earn it. Work options for women were limited and poorly paid. Laundry, serving, spinning. All necessary. None reliable. Debt collectors did not care about fairness. They cared about repayment. And brothels, conveniently, offered a way to turn a body into income immediately. Sometimes the offer was gentle. Just for a little while. Until the debt is cleared. It's better than starving. The language mattered. It softened the fall. Of course, debts rarely shrank. Fees were added. Rent was charged. Clothing was required. Food cost money. The math never worked in the workers' favor. Another path was deception. Young women arrived in cities looking for work. Domestic service. Tavern work. Sewing. Anything with a roof and regular meals. Recruiters knew this. They promised safety. Respectable positions. A place to sleep. The door closed behind them before the truth arrived. This was not always violent. That is important to understand. Violence leaves records. Deception leaves silence. By the time a woman realized where she was, leaving meant walking into a city with no money, no references, and often no way back home. The city did not offer help. The brothel did offer food. That imbalance did the rest. Orphanhood was another common road. Medieval Europe produced orphans constantly. Plague, war, childbirth. Children lost parents faster than society could replace them. Girls without family protection were especially vulnerable. They moved between households. Took small jobs. Slept where they could. Each move stripped a little more security away. Eventually, someone offered stability. A bed. Regular meals. Protection. The price came later. Family pressure also played a role, and this part makes people uncomfortable. It should. In desperate households, daughters were assets. Not emotionally. Practically. One less mouth to feed. One more debt resolved. One favor repaid. Sometimes families convinced themselves they were doing the right thing. Sending a daughter to a brothel was framed as temporary. As necessary. As survival. Sometimes it was not framed at all. It was a sale. These arrangements were rarely discussed openly. Shame kept them quiet. But court records and city laws hint at how common they were. Rules existed because behavior existed. And then there were women who technically walked in on their own. This is where the word choice causes trouble. Yes, some women arrived without being dragged or tricked. But choice implies options. Real ones. Safe ones. Choosing between hunger and exploitation is not freedom. It is triage. Medieval society loved to talk about free will. But it did not distribute it evenly. Once inside the system, pressure replaced force. Leaving meant debt. Leaving meant homelessness. Leaving meant being marked anyway, because once the city knew, it never forgot. So women stayed. Not because they wanted to. Because staying was safer than leaving. This is why recruitment did not need chains. It relied on imbalance. Money imbalance. Power imbalance. Information imbalance. Brothel keepers understood this well. They did not need to chase people. The city delivered them. And there is a quiet, dark humor here too. Medieval authorities worried endlessly about disorder. About chaos. About crime. Yet they allowed systems that quietly fed on desperation. Systems that created suffering in neat, manageable amounts. No riots. No noise. Just people slipping through cracks. Recruitment was rarely dramatic. No single villain twirling a mustache. Just a series of doors that closed behind someone faster than they realized. A missed payment. A broken promise. A bad harvest. A dead parent. Each one pushed a little harder. By the time a woman stood inside a brothel, the path behind her was already fading. That is why calling this work in the modern sense feels wrong. Work implies negotiation. Boundaries. Exit plans. Here, the boundaries were set by others. The exit was theoretical. Even language played a role. Cities called brothel workers public women. A category. Not individuals. A role you entered and never fully left. Once labeled, the city treated you accordingly. Laws changed. Punishments increased. Protection decreased. So when we ask how women ended up there, the honest answer is uncomfortable. They were guided. They were cornered. They were worn down. Choice existed only on paper. This chapter matters because it clears away another fantasy. The idea that medieval brothels were full of bold, rebellious women living outside society's rules. Most were not rebels. They were survivors navigating systems designed without them in mind. They did not storm the gates. They slipped through side doors. Quietly. One by one. As the night continues, remember this. Every rule, every transaction, every room is built on this foundation. Not freedom. Pressure. The city sleeps easier believing everything is under control. And somewhere, a woman remembers the moment she realized the word choice no longer applied. The night moves forward. Every medieval brothel had a center of gravity. It was not the building. It was not the city. It was not the clients. It was the brothel keeper. Often, this person was a woman. That surprises people. They expect a shadowy man with keys and threats. Sometimes that existed. But very often, the keeper was female. Older. Experienced. Someone who knew how the system worked because she had once been inside it. This did not make her kind. It made her practical. Brothel keepers lived in a narrow space between the city and the women who worked for them. Above them were laws, inspections, fines, and moral judgment. Below them were workers who depended on them for food, shelter, and access to money. Pressure came from both sides. Some keepers responded by being brutal. Others by being strict but predictable. A few by trying to look protective, even caring. But all of them enforced control. They had to. Inside the brothel, the keeper decided almost everything. Who worked which nights? Who got better rooms? Who had to take which clients? Who was punished and how? This power was not always loud. It did not need shouting. It lived in schedules, fees, and quiet decisions made when no one was watching. Schedules were important. Nights were divided carefully. Too many workers meant less money per person. Too few meant trouble with authorities or unhappy clients. The keeper balanced this like an accountant, not a host. You worked when you were told. You rested when you were allowed. If you were sick, that became a negotiation. Fees were constant. Rent for your room. Payment for food. Charges for candles. Fees for clothing required by law. Fines for being late. Fines for refusing a client. Fines for breaking a rule you might not even remember agreeing to. Money moved upward. This is where control became disguised as protection. Keepers often said they were offering safety. Protection from violent clients. Protection from the streets. Protection from the law. And sometimes, this was partly true. A brothel was safer than sleeping outside. Safer than begging. Safer than being alone. But safety came with conditions. Protection could be withdrawn. Punishments varied. Extra fees. Worse rooms. Harder schedules. Public scolding. Sometimes physical force. Not always. But often enough that the threat stayed real. And here is the uncomfortable part. Some keepers believed they were doing the right thing. They had survived. They had climbed one step up. They told themselves that discipline kept order. That order kept everyone alive. That softness led to chaos. In a medieval city, chaos was terrifying. So rules multiplied. You cannot leave after dark without permission. You cannot refuse too many clients. You must wear this clothing. You must be available at these hours. Rules create predictability. Predictability makes systems run smoothly. For the people inside those systems, smooth often means tight. The relationship between keeper and worker was complicated. It was not pure cruelty. It was not kindness. It was dependency. The keeper needed workers to earn money. Workers needed the keeper to stay housed and fed. Neither side had many alternatives. This created strange dynamics. Moments of generosity followed by strict punishment. Help given, then used as leverage later. Praise offered, then withdrawn. Emotional whiplash was common. Some keepers genuinely tried to reduce harm. They stepped in when clients became violent. They allowed rest when illness was obvious. They bent rules quietly. Others enforced rules harshly to stay in good standing with city officials. Inspections mattered. If the brothel lost its license, everyone lost their income. So the keeper's loyalty was always split. Upward to the city. Downward to the workers. Inward to survival. Humor, when it appeared, was dry and dark. Keepers joked about rules. About inspectors. About clients who thought they were special. Laughter helped release pressure, but it never erased the hierarchy. Everyone knew who held the keys. Literally. Keys mattered. They controlled storage rooms. Money chests. Doors. Access is power, and the keeper held it. At night, the keeper often stayed awake longer than anyone else. Listening. Watching. Counting. Making sure nothing exploded into chaos. A fight could bring guards. Guards brought fines. Fines hurt profits. Calm was valuable. So control stayed firm. The idea of the brothel as a place run by passion collapses here. This was administration. Management. Crisis prevention. Think less romance, more logistics. And like many managers under pressure, some keepers became harder over time. Empathy costs energy. When energy runs low, rules replace feeling. That is how systems protect themselves. For the women working there, the keeper could feel like everything at once. Boss. Gatekeeper. Threat. Shield. Judge. Provider. That confusion kept people off balance. And being off balance makes resistance harder. This is why calling the keeper simply a villain does not fully explain the role. The position itself demanded control. Anyone who held it too gently risked collapse. The system rewarded firmness. Sometimes brutality. Control disguised as protection was effective because it felt reasonable. I am keeping you safe. I am keeping order. I am doing this for your own good. These phrases have a long history. And they work. As the night moves forward in our story, the keeper will remain mostly unseen. Not because they are absent, but because they are always watching from just outside the frame. A door opens. They hear it. A voice rises. They note it. A rule bends. They remember. The brothel keeper does not need to be everywhere. The structure does the work. By morning, money will be counted. Fees recorded. Debts adjusted. Schedules changed. Another night managed. So when we imagine medieval brothels, remember this figure. Not glamorous. Not monstrous. Just central. A person shaped by pressure, passing that pressure down. The house stays standing because someone keeps it tight. And tight systems do not loosen easily. The lamps burn lower. The keeper watches. The night continues under careful control. If medieval brothels were chaotic places with no structure, history would be easier to understand. They were not. They were full of rules. So many rules. Written rules. Unwritten rules. Rules everyone pretended not to know, but followed anyway. This was not a free-for-all. This was an institution. Cities loved rules. Rules made life feel controllable. If something could be written down, counted, and enforced, it felt less dangerous. Desire was dangerous. So it needed rules more than anything else. Let's start with money. Prices in medieval brothels were often fixed by city authorities. Not negotiated. Not flexible. Posted or well known. This prevented arguments, undercutting, and chaos. It also protected clients more than workers. A set price meant no bargaining. No charging more for risk. No charging less to rest. No flexibility for bad nights or bad health. One coin meant one service. That was the idea. Time mattered just as much as money. Encounters were limited. Very limited. You were not paying for an evening. You were paying for a short window. A few minutes. Long enough to finish. Short enough to move on. No lingering. No talking too much. No naps. Time limits kept profits steady and reduced fights. They also reduced any chance of connection. Everything was rushed by design. If you imagine candles burning low over long conversations, please imagine an official tapping a ledger instead. Next came clothing. Cities were obsessed with clothing rules. Clothes told everyone who you were and where you belonged. Brothel workers were required to dress in specific ways. Certain colors. Certain fabrics. Sometimes specific accessories. The goal was visibility. You should never be mistaken for a respectable woman. That mattered deeply to medieval society. Clothing drew lines that could not be crossed accidentally. These rules followed women outside the brothel too. You could leave the building, but not the label. Even buying bread meant wearing your role. The city called this order. For the women, it meant constant exposure. Curfews were another favorite tool. Brothel workers were often restricted in when they could leave and where they could go. After certain hours, movement required permission. The logic was safety and control. Less wandering meant fewer problems. Inspections enforced all of this. City officials visited brothels to check compliance. Prices. Clothing. Behavior. Sometimes health, though that was very basic and mostly symbolic. These visits were stressful. Fines were common. Warnings were issued. Records were updated. Names were rarely written down, but numbers always were. Inspectors did not arrive to help. They arrived to confirm order. And here is where the humor creeps in again. Medieval authorities trusted rules deeply, even when rules clearly did not fix the underlying problem. Disease still spread. Violence still happened. Exploitation still existed. But the rules looked good on paper. Rules allowed leaders to say, "We have this under control." That mattered more than reality. Rules also created predictability. Everyone knew what was allowed and what was punished. That predictability reduced open rebellion. People adapt quickly when boundaries are clear. Even bad systems work better when they are consistent. Inside the brothel, rules became routine. You stop questioning them. You build your day around them. You internalize them. When can I eat? When can I rest? When can I refuse? Eventually, the questions stop. You already know the answers. Rules also protected the brothel's reputation. If something went wrong, officials could say the rules were clear. Blame could be assigned downward. Rarely upward. That was convenient. There were rules for noise. Rules for drinking. Rules for behavior with guards. Rules for behavior during religious holidays. Sometimes brothels were closed entirely on certain days, not out of mercy, but symbolism. Sin could rest. Order could not. Breaking rules carried consequences. Fines were the most common. Money solved everything, if you had it. If you did not, punishments escalated. Loss of work nights. Worse rooms. Extra duties. Public scolding. Sometimes physical punishment, depending on time and place. The system did not need to be cruel every day. It only needed to be cruel occasionally to stay effective. What is striking is how normal all of this felt to medieval people. The rules were not shocking. They were expected. Life itself was rule-heavy. Guilds had rules. Churches had rules. Homes had rules. Brothels simply followed the same logic. This makes the modern idea of medieval brothels as wild and unregulated feel almost funny. The reality was closer to a poorly ventilated office with strict dress codes and bad hours. Not exactly thrilling. Rules gave the illusion of safety. They suggested fairness. Fixed prices seemed equal. Time limits seemed neutral. Clothing rules seemed clear. But neutrality often hides imbalance. Rules were written by authorities who did not work there. Enforced by people who did not suffer the consequences. Adjusted to protect order, not people. That is how rules tend to work when power is uneven. And yet, rules also created small spaces of resistance. Knowing the system meant knowing where it bent. A moment of extra rest. A quiet refusal. A signal between workers. Tiny cracks. But cracks are not freedom. As the night deepens, these rules will shape everything that happens next. How fast things move. How tired people become. How emotions are swallowed. The brothel does not feel chaotic because chaos is bad for business. It feels controlled. Tight. Measured. Every minute counted. Every coin counted. Every body counted. So when we imagine medieval brothels, remove the idea of indulgent disorder. Replace it with structure. Replace it with schedules and inspections. Replace it with rules stacked on rules. The city sleeps better knowing there is a system. The system sleeps lightly, waiting for the next inspection. And inside it, people learn to move carefully. Because in a world ruled by rules, survival depends on knowing exactly where the lines are. The lamps flicker. The ledger closes. The night continues, neatly managed. Clothing mattered a lot in the medieval world. More than comfort. More than style. More than weather. Clothing told the city who you were before you ever spoke. In medieval brothels, clothing was not a personal choice. It was a rule. A loud one. Many cities required women who worked in brothels to wear specific colors, ribbons, or badges. Sometimes it was yellow. Sometimes red. Sometimes striped fabric. Sometimes a visible knot, sash, or ribbon sewn in just the right place. The exact detail changed from city to city. The idea did not. You must be seen. This was not about decoration. It was about clarity. Medieval authorities cared deeply about making social boundaries visible. You should know who belonged where at a glance. Confusion was dangerous. Order depended on recognition. So brothel workers were marked. Not with ink. With cloth. The city told itself this was practical. It prevented mistakes. It protected respectable women from being confused with public women. It kept temptation clearly labeled. But shame was not the real goal. Visibility was. Shame fades. Visibility sticks. If you are ashamed, you can hide. If you are visible, hiding becomes harder. That was the point. These clothing rules followed women everywhere. Inside the brothel, outside the brothel. Buying bread. Fetching water. Walking down a street in daylight. The marker stayed on. You could leave the building, but not the role. This is where the fantasy of easy escape quietly collapses. You cannot just work for a while and then blend back into normal life. The clothing told the story before you did. And once people see you a certain way, they keep seeing you that way. Medieval society trusted clothing more than words. If you wore the marker, you were defined by it. Your past did not matter. Your reasons did not matter. Your future barely mattered. The label did all the work. Some cities claimed this system protected women by making their role clear. No misunderstandings. No false expectations. Everyone knows what this is. That sounds reasonable until you realize it also removed any chance of being seen as anything else. The marker was not temporary. Even if rules changed, memory did not. Neighbors noticed. Shopkeepers noticed. Guards noticed. People remembered. And medieval memory was long. Clothing also made enforcement easier. Guards could spot violations instantly. Inspectors could see compliance without asking questions. Punishment could be quick. No paperwork needed. This constant exposure shaped behavior. Many women avoided daylight. Avoided busy streets. Avoided attention when they could. The clothing made every public moment feel like a small performance. Eyes followed. Judgments arrived silently. It is hard to imagine today how heavy that feels. Modern life allows some anonymity. Medieval cities did not. Everyone lived close. Everyone noticed changes. The marker turned ordinary movement into a reminder. You are known. You are watched. You are separate. And here is the quiet cruelty of it. The clothing was often uncomfortable or impractical. Bright colors drew attention. Certain fabrics were harder to clean. Ribbons tore easily and had to be replaced. Of course, replacements cost money. So even the marker itself fed the system. You paid to stay labeled. Some women tried to bend the rules. A ribbon tied looser. A color darkened with dirt. A cloak pulled forward. Small acts of resistance. Sometimes they worked. Sometimes they led to fines. And fines reminded you why the rules existed. There is a small, bitter humor in how medieval morality worked here. The same society that condemned these women for their role insisted on making that role impossible to escape. It created the category. It enforced the category. Then it blamed the category for existing. That circular logic was very stable. The permanence of labeling mattered most. Once marked, always marked. Even if you left the brothel. Even if you married. Even if you moved. Rumors traveled faster than people. A woman who tried to return to village life often found doors closed quietly. Work dried up. Invitations stopped. The clothing might be gone, but the memory stayed. Medieval society loved redemption stories in sermons. In practice, redemption was rare. Labels were sticky. This made brothels feel less like temporary places and more like destinations. Not chosen, but arrived at. Once there, the road back was foggy at best. And the city liked it that way. Clear boundaries meant fewer questions. Fewer exceptions. Fewer uncomfortable conversations. Clothing turned human lives into visible categories. From a distance, it looked like order. Up close, it felt like a cage made of fabric. The marker also affected how clients behaved. Visibility reduced accountability. If someone is already labeled, respect feels optional. Boundaries weaken. Behavior shifts. Clothing changes how people are treated. It always has. Medieval cities understood that deeply. So when we imagine medieval brothels, we should imagine streets where a woman could not simply disappear into a crowd. Her clothing announced her before she spoke. Every step outside the building carried risk. Not physical danger always, but social weight. The constant reminder that the city saw her as one thing. And only one thing. This chapter is not about fashion. It is about memory. About how societies remember people by what they force them to wear. The clothing marked you forever, not because cloth lasts, but because meaning does. As the night continues, these markers will shape interactions silently. Who is listened to? Who is ignored? Who is believed? The city does not need signs on the walls. It writes its rules on bodies. A ribbon. A color. A badge. Small things. Heavy consequences. The night moves on. The streets grow quieter. The markers remain visible in the lantern light. And the label stays, long after the door closes behind you. Evenings did not arrive suddenly in medieval cities. They leaked in. The light faded slowly, like someone turning a dim wheel you could not see. Shadows stretched longer before anyone noticed. The street changed color. Stone went from pale to gray. Then from gray to something softer and less certain. Dusk settled in. In the brothel street, this moment mattered. Day and night were very different worlds. During the day, doors stayed closed. Windows stayed dark. The place pretended not to exist. At dusk, pretending stopped. Someone lit the first lamp. Not a bright one. Just enough. A small flame behind cloudy glass. It flickered like it was unsure about its job. Then another lamp followed. Then another. Light appeared in pieces, not all at once. Doors opened slowly. Not wide. Just enough to signal readiness. The sound of wood against stone carried further in the quiet. The street was not busy yet. That came later. Right now, it hovered. Waiting has a sound. It is not silence. It is softer than noise. Footsteps passing without stopping. A cough somewhere. The river moving nearby, doing what it always did. Inside, people adjusted themselves. Clothes were checked. Ribbons fixed. Lamps repositioned to hide more than they showed. Straw was shifted. Windows cracked open, then closed again when the air felt too cold. No one rushed. Rushing was for emergencies. This was routine. Anticipation crept in quietly. It did not announce itself. It sat in shoulders and hands. In the way people stood near doors but did not touch them. In the way voices stayed low. Anticipation was mixed with dread. Always. You could feel it without words. The night might be busy. That meant money. That also meant exhaustion. It might be slow. That meant waiting, boredom, and worry about tomorrow. Both were tiring. This is where the modern imagination often fills in excitement. The idea that evenings in brothels buzzed with energy and thrill. But the truth was calmer. Heavier. Think less party, more shift starting. People prepared the way workers do everywhere. Mentally checking what lies ahead. How long it might last. Whether anything will go wrong. Someone joked quietly. Not loudly. Loud jokes attract attention. This was a dry comment. A small laugh. The kind that releases tension without inviting more. Humor mattered here. It kept fear from taking over completely. Outside, the street changed. Taverns grew louder elsewhere in the city. Drunk voices floated faintly across water or alleys. The brothel street stayed restrained. Clients arrived one by one. Not in groups. Not loudly. A figure pauses. Looks. Steps closer. Another follows later. No one lined up. Waiting went both ways. Inside the building, the keeper watched the door. Not obviously. Casually. But every opening was noted. Every delay mattered. Time stretched strangely in these early moments. Minutes felt longer. Lamps burned faster than expected. The air shifted as more bodies entered the space. The building woke up slowly. Anticipation sharpened as the first client crossed the threshold. That first step mattered. It broke the stillness. It set the tone. Was he sober? Was he calm? Was he rough? You learned quickly to read signs. The way someone held their shoulders. How fast they spoke. Whether they avoided eye contact or stared too long. Dread lived in those details. Not every client was dangerous. But you could not know which night would bring trouble. That uncertainty never went away. It sat beside anticipation like an unwanted companion. The lamps made everything look closer than it was. Shadows pressed in. Corners darkened. The world outside faded. The city felt far away now, even if it was only a few steps beyond the door. As dusk deepened into night, more people arrived. The waiting thinned. Movement increased. Schedules began to matter. The quiet turned into a low hum. Still controlled. Still measured. No music announced the night. No cheers. Just the steady rhythm of routine. This was when the body started preparing too. Muscles tightened. Breath adjusted. You braced without thinking about it. Like stepping into cold water. Anticipation had layers. Hope for an easy night. Fear of a bad one. Calculation about money. Concern about health. Worry about tomorrow. Dread threaded through all of it. And yet, this was also the most alert part of the night. Before exhaustion set in. Before tempers frayed. Before rules blurred. This moment held possibility. That is why it felt sharp. Outside, the last of daylight disappeared completely. The street belonged to lamps now. Faces were half-lit. Names mattered less than gestures. The brothel was fully awake. Waiting ended gradually, not suddenly. The first hour decided much. A smooth start eased nerves. A rough one set teeth on edge. No one said this out loud. Everyone felt it. This chapter of the night did not last long. Soon, activity took over. Movement replaced stillness. Anticipation burned itself out. But this beginning mattered. It set the mood. It framed the hours ahead. So when you imagine a medieval brothel evening, do not imagine doors flying open and laughter spilling out. Imagine lamps being lit one by one. Doors opening carefully. People standing quietly with their thoughts. Imagine anticipation sitting next to dread, neither one winning. The night has not done anything yet. That is what makes this moment heavy. The city settles into darkness. The street holds its breath. Inside, everyone waits. And the evening, ordinary and unforgiving, begins. When people imagine medieval brothels, they often imagine rich men. Velvet sleeves. Heavy rings. Leisure time. Slow voices. That picture belongs somewhere else. Most clients were not nobles. Nobles had other options. Private arrangements. Servants who knew how to stay quiet. Power that followed them everywhere. The men who came here were mostly laborers, soldiers, and apprentices. Men who worked with their hands all day. Men whose bodies were already tired before the night even started. Men who slept in shared rooms, on hard floors, or not at all. These were not romantic figures. They were ordinary, worn-down people looking for something simple and fast. Laborers came after long days. Their hands were rough. Calloused. Sometimes still dirty no matter how much they washed. Their backs ached. Their patience was thin. Soldiers came with a different energy. Restless. Loud when drunk. Quiet when not. Some were lonely. Some were angry. Some carried things they could not put down easily. Apprentices were younger. Often awkward. Often nervous. They had little money and big expectations. Sometimes too big. None of them came for love. This was not a place for romance. No courtship. No poetry. No promises. Everything about the system discouraged emotional attachment. Time was short. Rules were strict. The goal was clear. Get in. Pay. Leave. That simplicity mattered to the city. It reduced problems. It reduced fights over expectations. But simplicity does not mean gentleness. Exhaustion shaped behavior. When people are tired, they rush. When they rush, they forget manners. When they forget manners, power shows itself clearly. The power imbalance was always there. Clients had money, even if it was little. Workers needed it. That difference shaped every interaction. It did not need to be spoken. Everyone felt it. Rough hands were not always intentional. They came from lives spent lifting, digging, carrying. But roughness does not disappear just because a room is smaller and darker. Impatience followed exhaustion. Waiting felt harder. Time limits felt annoying. Rules felt personal. Some clients behaved decently. Quiet. Direct. Finished quickly. Left. Others pushed. Asked for more time. More attention. More than the rules allowed. Not because they were cruel, but because they were used to pushing in other parts of life. Power teaches habits. The brothel system assumed this. That is why rules existed. That is why keepers stayed alert. That is why workers learned to read moods quickly. A raised voice early in the night was a warning. A clenched jaw. A refusal to make eye contact. Small signs mattered. Humor sometimes helped. A dry comment. A light tease. Not flirtation. Deflection. A way to steer the moment away from trouble. But humor had limits. When impatience met power, humor stepped aside. It is important to say this clearly. Most clients were not monsters. They were not villains from a story. They were men shaped by hard lives and hard systems. That does not erase harm. It explains how it became normal. Medieval society trained men to see certain women as available by default. Clothing marked that. Location reinforced it. Rules supported it. So respect was optional. This is where the imbalance settled in deepest. A client could leave and return to normal life. A worker stayed marked. Stayed visible. Stayed in place. The night ended for one side. It continued for the other. And this is the quiet truth behind the fantasy. The brothel was not an escape from medieval hierarchy. It was one of its clearest expressions. Different classes met in a small room. The rules pretended they were equal for a few minutes. They were not. As the night moves on, clients will come and go. Faces blur. Voices repeat. Patterns settle. Rough hands. Tired eyes. Impatience softened or sharpened by drink. Nothing romantic. Nothing dramatic. Just ordinary people moving through a system that favors one side every time. The door opens. The door closes. And the imbalance stays exactly where it was. In medieval brothels, time was not a feeling. It was a unit. It could be counted. Measured. Argued over. Ended abruptly. No one asked how the night felt. They asked how long it took. Encounters were rushed by design. The rules made sure of that. A client paid for a short window, not an experience. No stretching it. No drifting. No slow moments that turned into something else. A few minutes. That was it. If you imagine long conversations and lingering touches, you are imagining something the system actively avoided. Lingering creates attachment. Attachment creates problems. Problems attract attention. The city did not like attention. So everything moved fast. Money changed hands. The door closed. Time started ticking. When it was done, it was done. Not gently. Not politely. Just finished. This was not about intimacy. Intimacy takes time. It takes comfort. It takes the sense that no one is watching the clock. Here, the clock was always watching. Even when there was no clock on the wall, everyone felt it. In the keeper's glance. In the way someone shifted near the door. In the knowledge that another person was already waiting. No one was special. No one was unique. The system worked because everyone was replaceable. That sounds harsh. It was. The physical toll of this pace was real. Bodies are not meant to move like machines. Repetition wears things down. Muscles ache. Joints stiffen. Small injuries add up. There was no concept of rest days built into the system. Rest happened only when business slowed or when someone became too ill to stand. Even then, rest came with guilt. Rest meant lost money. Lost money meant more pressure later. The body learned to push past discomfort. That skill kept people working. It also caused damage that never fully healed. Pain became background noise. This is where emotional detachment entered quietly. When something happens over and over, you stop feeling it fully. That is not cruelty. It is survival. Detachment protects the mind when the body cannot escape. You do not invest emotionally in moments that end quickly. You do not open yourself when the clock is ticking. You learn to stay somewhere else inside your head. People call this coldness from the outside. From the inside, it feels like breathing. There is a small, dry humor in how medieval authorities talked about time limits as a moral solution. Short encounters, they believed, reduced sin. Reduced temptation. Reduced attachment. What they really reduced was humanity. Time limits stripped moments down to their bare function. Transaction complete. Next. For clients, this sometimes felt frustrating. For workers, it felt numbing. And numbness was useful. Emotional detachment did not mean emotion disappeared. It meant it was stored away. Locked up for later. Later rarely came. This detachment also protected people from disappointment. Expecting kindness in a rushed system leads to pain. Expecting efficiency leads to less. So expectations shrank. No romance. No promises. No pretending. Just minutes passing. As the night went on, the pace took its toll. Bodies slowed. Movements grew heavier. Smiles faded into neutral expressions that required less effort. The clock kept moving. Time was money, and money was survival. That equation ruled everything. The system rewarded speed, not care. Endurance, not feeling. By the end of the night, people were emptied out. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like a room after furniture is removed. So when we think about medieval brothels, remember this rhythm. Not passion. Not indulgence. Repetition. Minutes measured. Bodies pushed. Emotions folded inward. The clock does not care how you feel. It only cares that you are ready when the door opens again. And the door always opens again. Medieval brothels had rules for money, clothing, and time. They did not have real medicine. This is important. People today often imagine that sickness was treated badly in the past. That is true. But it is also incomplete. The bigger problem was not bad treatment. It was confusion. People did not know what sickness was. They knew pain. Fever. Sores. Weakness. They knew when someone stopped standing up straight or stopped eating. They knew when someone disappeared. They did not know why. There was no understanding of bacteria. No viruses. No clear idea of infection. Disease was explained through imbalance, bad air, bad blood, bad luck, or punishment. Sometimes all at once. In brothels, illness felt constant. Crowded rooms. Poor air. Damp walls. Reused straw. Tired bodies. All of this made sickness common and fast-moving. People noticed patterns, but they could not explain them. Someone got sick after a busy week. Someone else followed. Then another. Fear spread faster than knowledge. Folk remedies filled the gap. Herbs, baths, prayers, charms, bloodletting, oils, and strange mixtures with strong smells. If something felt active, it felt helpful. Sometimes these remedies did nothing. Sometimes they made things worse. Occasionally, by accident, they helped a little. That was enough to keep belief alive. Superstition also played a role. Certain days were unlucky. Certain behaviors invited illness. Certain women were blamed more than others. Fear needs targets. Brothel keepers and city officials worried about disease, but mostly because it threatened order. A sick worker meant lost income. A visible illness meant panic. Panic meant attention. So illness was often hidden until it could not be. People worked while sick. Fever did not excuse you. Pain did not stop the clock. Only complete collapse ended a shift. By then, it was often too late. The inevitability of illness shaped behavior quietly. People did not expect long health. They expected decline. This sounds bleak, but it also normalized suffering. When sickness is common, it stops feeling exceptional. Fear was constant, but vague. Without language to explain disease, fear floated. It attached itself to smells, seasons, and people. Cold air became suspicious. Warm air too. Water was both healing and dangerous. Everything could be blamed. There is a small, dark humor in how medieval people tried to manage health. They noticed that certain rooms felt worse. That certain times of year brought more sickness. But without tools to understand why, they leaned on ritual. Open a window. Burn incense. Say a prayer. It felt like action. For the women working there, illness carried extra weight. Being sick made you less useful. Less useful meant more pressure. More pressure meant less rest. Recovery was rare. People learned to live at half strength. Emotionally, this uncertainty was exhausting. Fear without explanation has nowhere to go. You cannot plan against it. You cannot argue with it. So people adapted. They lowered expectations. They accepted that bodies fail. When someone disappeared, there was little ceremony. No long reflection. The system moved on. That does not mean people did not care. It means caring openly did not change outcomes. Silence became practical. As the night continues, health remains a quiet background worry. A cough. A sore throat. A weakness ignored. No one says much. Everyone notices. So when we imagine medieval brothels, we should imagine fear without clarity. Illness without understanding. Care without tools. Not neglect by choice. Ignorance by limitation. The lamps burn. The air stays heavy. Bodies work past what they should. And fear sits quietly in the room, unnamed, waiting its turn. Violence in medieval brothels was not constant. That is important to say. It did not happen every night. It was not always loud. It was not always dramatic. Which is exactly why it was dangerous. Aggression was normalized. Raised voices. Rough movement. Grabbing that went a little too far. Words that cut sharper than hands. None of this stopped the room. It barely slowed it. When something happens often enough, it stops being shocking. It becomes part of the background. Like bad air or damp walls. People adjusted their expectations. Officially, brothels were supervised. Rules existed. Inspectors came. Guards were nearby. On paper, this meant protection. In practice, protection was limited. Guards did not stay inside. They arrived after problems grew loud enough. By then, damage was already done. And even then, responses depended on who complained and who was involved. A worker complaining against a client was a weak case. Money spoke louder. Violence that left visible marks sometimes mattered. Violence that did not was easy to ignore. Bruises faded. Fear did not count as evidence. So most incidents ended quietly. Not because they were rare. But because speaking up cost more than staying silent. Complaints rarely mattered because the system was not built to hear them. Authorities cared about order, not individual harm. As long as business continued and streets stayed calm, the system worked. And silence helped keep it working. Workers learned quickly what was worth mentioning and what was not. A broken object might be reported. A missing coin too. Pain was negotiable. Fear was personal. Silence became a strategy. You stayed quiet to avoid attention. You stayed quiet to avoid blame. You stayed quiet because you still had to work tomorrow. This silence was not weakness. It was calculation. There is a small, uncomfortable humor in how medieval records describe brothels as orderly places. Order did not mean gentle. It meant predictable. Aggression followed patterns. People learned them. You knew which clients to avoid eye contact with. Which voices meant trouble. Which nights required extra caution. This knowledge passed quietly between workers. No speeches. Just looks. Short warnings. Shared understanding. Official oversight could not replace this kind of knowledge. Sometimes a keeper stepped in. Sometimes not. Intervention depended on risk. Would this cause a scene? Would this bring guards? Would this cost money? Protection had limits. Violence also did not need to be physical to be effective. Threats worked. Pressure worked. The reminder that refusal carried consequences worked. Aggression lived in tone and posture as much as action. And because it was normalized, it did not feel like an emergency. It felt like weather. Unpleasant, but expected. Silence also protected people emotionally. Talking about violence makes it real. Naming it gives it weight. Silence lets it pass through you faster. You survive by not stopping to examine every wound. This does not mean people forgot. It means they compartmentalized. At night, the system relied on this silence. Noise attracts attention. Attention brings authority. Authority brings disruption. Silence kept the machine running. So when violence happened, it often ended without witnesses, records, or consequences. The room reset. The next client entered. The night continued. This is one of the hardest parts of the story. Not because it is shocking, but because it is quiet. Violence without outrage. Harm without response. That quiet made it normal. As the night moves forward, remember this. Silence is not empty. It is full of decisions. Calculations. Fear weighed against survival. People stayed silent not because they had nothing to say, but because speaking did not make things safer. The lamps flicker. The room settles again. Voices lower. The system holds. And silence, heavy but necessary, does its work. Religion was everywhere in medieval life. Church bells set the day. Saints watched from walls. God was involved in weather, crops, illness, and success. Nothing escaped the moral lens. Except, somehow, brothels. Or rather, brothels both escaped and did not escape at the same time. This is where things get strange. Officially, the church condemned prostitution. Sermons warned against it. Texts described it as sinful, dangerous, and spiritually damaging. Everyone knew this. No confusion there. And yet, brothels existed openly. In some cities, they were licensed. Regulated. Taxed. Inspected. Condemnation and tolerance lived side by side. Not comfortably. But consistently. The logic went like this. Humans are sinful. Desire is hard to control. It is better, the argument said, to allow a controlled outlet than to let sin spread everywhere. This idea shows up again and again in medieval religious writing. Prostitution was compared to sewers. You do not love a sewer. You do not praise it. But you accept that it keeps worse things away. This comparison tells you a lot. It removes humanity from the people involved. It turns living beings into infrastructure. Necessary. Unpleasant. Ignored when working properly. Confession added another layer to the contradiction. Clients could confess their actions. Priests might scold them. Assign prayers. Encourage restraint. And then life went on. Workers, on the other hand, existed in a strange spiritual space. They could confess, but absolution was often unclear. Repentance required leaving the life. Leaving the life was often impossible. So confession became routine, but hollow. You admit guilt. You promise change. You return to the same place. This cycle wore people down. Religion offered language for sin, but not a path out of it. Churches also benefited indirectly from brothels, though this was rarely spoken aloud. Brothel taxes supported city budgets. City budgets supported churches. Donations flowed. Property overlapped. Money moves quietly. No priest stood up and thanked a brothel for new roof tiles. But the connection existed. Everyone knew it. No one pointed too hard. This created moral distance. It was easy to condemn from afar. Easy to preach ideals. Harder to dismantle systems that kept cities running. So religion focused on appearances. Keep sin contained. Keep it visible. Keep it away from sacred spaces. Brothels were often placed far from churches, or at least out of direct view. Physical distance helped maintain moral distance. You could hear the bells without seeing the consequences. For workers, this meant living in permanent contradiction. Labeled sinful, but useful. Condemned, but tolerated. Visible, but unheard. Religion did not comfort them much. It explained suffering as punishment or trial. It promised reward later. Later was vague. Hope deferred became habit. There is a quiet, sad humor in how medieval morality worked here. Society built systems that required sin, then blamed individuals for participating in them. Religion gave that blame a language. And yet, faith still mattered. People prayed. They lit candles. They hoped for mercy. Even when institutions failed them, belief offered something private. Not solutions. But meaning. As the night moves on, religion stays in the background. Bells ring. Prayers are said. Rules remain unchanged. Condemnation without action. Tolerance without care. The city sleeps comfortably believing its soul is protected. And somewhere, under the same sky, people live inside a moral gap no sermon ever closed. The lamps burn low. The bells fade. And faith, complicated and distant, watches quietly from the edges of the night. From the outside, medieval brothels looked like places where money flowed. Coins changed hands. Ledgers filled. Taxes were collected. The city nodded with approval. From the inside, money barely stopped moving long enough to be held. Most of what clients paid did not stay with the workers. It passed through them. Like water through a cracked cup. First came rent. The room was not free. Even the bad ones. Even the damp ones. You paid to sleep where you worked. Then food. Not luxury meals. Basic bread, stew, maybe ale. Enough to keep going. Enough to charge for. Then clothing. The required clothing. The visible clothing. Ribbons, colors, fabric that met city rules. When it wore out, you replaced it. When it tore, you paid. Candles cost money. Straw cost money. Washing cost money. Being sick sometimes cost money too. By the time the night ended, very little remained. This is where fines entered the picture. Fines were everywhere. Late to a shift. A missed client. Breaking a rule you did not know existed. Speaking back. Being too loud. Being too quiet. Almost anything could be turned into a fine. Fines were useful. They corrected behavior and moved money upward. Clean and efficient. If you could not pay immediately, the fine became debt. Debt was the real trap. Once debt existed, everything changed. You owed the keeper. Owing someone who controls your work is not neutral. It shapes decisions. It limits refusal. It turns tomorrow into a problem you cannot escape. Debt also grew quietly. Interest was not always written down, but extra charges appeared. Food credit. Clothing advances. Medical help that barely helped. The math never worked out. You worked to pay off debt. But working created new costs. Costs created more debt. The circle tightened. This is why escape was nearly impossible. Leaving meant settling debts. Settling debts required money. Money required working. And working kept you inside the system. It was a door that opened only inward. Some women saved small amounts secretly. Hidden coins. Tiny acts of hope. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes a fine erased months of saving in one moment. The system was not designed to let people leave easily. Stability for the brothel mattered more than mobility for workers. From the city's perspective, this made sense. A stable workforce meant predictable income. Predictable income meant order. Order always won. There is a bitter humor in how medieval authorities talked about brothels as economic opportunities. Opportunities for whom was never discussed too closely. Money moved upward reliably. Risk moved downward. Workers carried the risk. Illness. Injury. Aging. Violence. Debt. When usefulness declined, support disappeared. No pensions. No refunds. No thank you for years of work. The economics of desperation did not need cruelty to function. It relied on arithmetic. Small charges repeated often. Small losses multiplied. Hope became expensive. People learned to think short-term. Get through tonight. Pay today's costs. Worry about tomorrow later. Later rarely arrived. This financial pressure shaped behavior as much as fear or rules. You accepted things you should not accept. You stayed silent when you should speak. You worked when your body asked you to stop. Because debt does not care how tired you are. By the time someone realized escape was unlikely, the realization felt dull, not dramatic. Like discovering a door has been locked for a long time. So when we imagine medieval brothels, remember this quiet truth. The system did not trap people with chains. It trapped them with numbers. Small ones. Repeated endlessly. The night continues. Coins clink. Ledgers close. And desperation keeps perfect accounts. As the night goes on, things do not get louder all at once. They get softer in the wrong ways. Drunkenness increases first. Not suddenly. Gradually. A little more slurred speech. A little less balance. A little more confidence than skill. Ale and wine were not luxuries. They were normal. Water was risky. Alcohol felt safer. So people drank. A lot. Especially at night. Drunk clients were not always violent. Many were just slower. Louder. More emotional. They talked too much. Or repeated the same story like it was new each time. But alcohol loosened things that rules tried to hold tight. Voices rose. Boundaries bent. Patience ran thin. At the same time, fatigue set in. This was the deep tired. The kind that sinks into bones. Bodies had already worked all day before the night even began. Now they worked again. Feet hurt. Backs stiffened. Heads felt heavy. Movements lost precision. Fatigue made everything harder. Smiles cost more effort. Anger surfaced faster. Mistakes happened more often. And mistakes in this place were expensive. This is when control started to slip. Not fully. Not dramatically. Just enough to matter. Rules still existed, but enforcement grew uneven. The keeper might be busy elsewhere. Guards were less alert. People assumed they could push a little more. And sometimes they were right. Risk increased quietly. A drunk client missed a cue. A tired worker reacted slower. A raised voice went unchecked a second too long. Small delays had consequences. The slow passing of hours made time feel strange. Early in the night, minutes dragged. Now they blurred. You stopped counting precisely. You counted by candles burning low or lamps dimming. Time did not feel measured anymore. It felt endured. Conversations repeated. Faces blurred together. Names were forgotten. Patterns took over. One door opens. One door closes. Again. This repetition was numbing. That numbness helped people get through it. It also made them less alert. There is a quiet irony here. The later the night, the less anyone wanted trouble. Everyone was too tired for it. And yet, this was when trouble was more likely. Exhaustion and alcohol do not mix well. Humor, when it appeared, turned darker. Sharper comments. Shorter laughs. Less patience for nonsense. Jokes stopped being shields and became weapons. Most nights still passed without disaster. That mattered. The system relied on most nights being ordinary. But the risk never left. This was the stretch of the night where people held their breath without realizing it. Just get through the next hour. Then the next. Dawn felt very far away. Bodies moved on habit. Minds drifted. Emotional detachment deepened. You were not thinking about tomorrow. Tomorrow was too abstract. You were thinking about finishing this moment. The building felt heavier now. Air thicker. Lamps dimmer. The outside world silent except for distant water or the occasional cart. Even the city seemed tired. This was when mistakes felt more dangerous, not because they were bigger, but because no one had energy left to fix them. A spilled drink. A slammed door. A misunderstood look. Things escalated faster when patience ran out. So people learned to move carefully. Slower. Quieter. Less eye contact. Less talking. Survival mode deepened. As the hours passed, the night lost its beginning and its end. It became one long stretch of effort. The idea of time softened into something you pushed through. The deep night was not dramatic. It was heavy. And heaviness wears people down. Eventually, somewhere far off, the night would start to loosen. But not yet. For now, drunkenness sways. Fatigue settles. Control weakens just enough to be dangerous. The lamps flicker. The hours crawl. And the night deepens, asking everyone to hold on a little longer. By now, the night has gone on long enough. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way that begs for a climax or a lesson written in bold letters. Just long enough for tiredness to feel normal. That is how most medieval nights ended. Not with answers. Not with change. Just with the slow understanding that tomorrow would look very similar to today. A night in a medieval brothel was harder than you think, not because it was shocking, but because it asked people to keep going without expecting relief. It did not promise transformation. It did not reward endurance with meaning. It simply continued. When modern people imagine the past, they often imagine moments that feel important. Turning points. Decisions. Scenes that would look good in a painting. Most medieval life did not feel like that from the inside. It felt repetitive. The same street. The same door. The same lamps. The same rules. Night after night. That repetition is what made it hard. There was no single villain to defeat. No moment where someone could stand up and say, enough. The pressure was spread evenly, like weight across a long walk. You do not collapse immediately. You just grow tired in places you did not know could be tired. The women did not endure because they were heroic. They endured because endurance was cheaper than resistance. Because resistance required energy they did not have. Because the system was built to absorb quiet suffering without changing shape. The keepers did not control because they loved power. They controlled because control kept things from falling apart. Disorder brought guards. Guards brought fines. Fines ruined everyone's night. So control became routine. The city did not allow brothels because it was relaxed about morality. It allowed them because it feared chaos more than contradiction. It preferred quiet discomfort over loud disorder. That fear built walls, rules, schedules, clothing, debts. It built a system that could run itself while everyone pretended not to look too closely. Harder than you think. Not because of one terrible night, but because of thousands of ordinary ones. As the night ends, nothing dramatic happens. The lamps burn lower. Oil thins. Flames grow small and uncertain. Someone pinches one out. Then another. Shadows soften. Corners return to darkness. The last clients leave quietly. Not proud. Not ashamed. Just done. Doors close again, carefully. Not slammed. Slamming invites questions. The street empties without comment. No one applauds survival. Inside, people move slowly now. Counting coins. Counting steps. Counting mistakes. Counting how many hours remain before sleep is allowed. Bodies ache in familiar ways. New pains blend into old ones. There is no sharp ending to effort. Just a gradual slowing. Outside, the city sleeps. Not deeply. Medieval cities never slept deeply. There are always guards, animals, water moving, carts starting early. But it sleeps comfortably enough. Comfort built on distance. From the center of the city, the night seems calm. Orderly. Managed. Lamps glow where they should. Streets stay quiet. Rules hold. The edges do their work quietly. As dawn approaches, the brothel fades back into invisibility. Doors stay shut. Windows darken. The building becomes just another shape against stone and mud. People pass without looking. That is how it is meant to work. By morning, markets open. Bread is sold. Tools are lifted. Bells ring. Life continues with the confidence of routine. Few people think about the night that just ended. They do not need to. The system does not ask for gratitude. This is why the phrase, "harder than you think," matters so much. It reminds us that difficulty is not always loud. Sometimes it is calm. Sometimes it is organized. Sometimes it is perfectly legal. The medieval brothel was not chaos breaking through order. It was order managing chaos quietly. It asked people to trade visibility for silence. Dignity for stability. Tomorrow for today. And because it did not look like disaster, it lasted. History often remembers extremes. Wars. Plagues. Kings. Fires. It forgets nights like this. Ordinary nights where nothing changes, but everything is shaped. That is why bedtime is the right place for this story. Because bedtime is not about excitement. It is about slowing down. About letting thoughts settle without needing to solve them. As you rest now, you do not need to judge the past. You do not need to compare it to the present. You only need to notice it. Notice how systems feel from the inside. Notice how endurance replaces hope. Notice how silence becomes practical. Then let it go. The past does not ask to be carried. The city breathes. Somewhere, water moves under a bridge. Somewhere, a guard shifts weight from one foot to the other. Somewhere, a candle goes out on its own. Nothing announces the end of the night. It simply arrives. And you can rest too. You are not inside that system. You are only listening to it from a distance, safely, calmly, without expectation. Your work tonight is finished. The lamps are low. The streets are quiet. The rules sleep lightly, ready to wake again tomorrow. History settles back into stillness. And you drift off, knowing that some nights were harder than you think, and that you do not have to live them to understand their weight. The city sleeps. And so can you. Good night.